Are you ready?
Hello, and welcome to the Whole House Podcast, where you can find home, health, and family all in one place. Our team is comprised of moms from different upbringings and backgrounds, and we each have different passions and giftings and strengths. We each represent a different room, and we all make up the whole house. So grab a cup of coffee and join our overly caffeinated ladies here for the Whole House Podcast.
Hi, today on the Whole House Podcast, it's Kathleen
and Lori,
and we're going to be talking about homeschooling as a lifestyle. But before we start, in the habit of Carly, we're going to ask a question. So what's one quirky habit that you have, Lori?
I think I have a habit of when I'm really nervous, I play with my fingers, and I don't notice until someone records me, and I look back and I'm like, oh, what am I doing? But I pull at my cuticles, or especially my thumbs, and I don't know why it's just my thumbs, but it's really weird. But that's something quirky.
Yeah, I think we all have quirky habits, and one of the habits that Lori and I were talking about together before we started the podcast is we both love to walk. Mm-hmm. And we consider it our therapy because we talk about everything and we solve all the world's problems in an hour walk. So we just talk about everything there is under the sun. But my quirky habit is I have a really difficult time leaving the house unless everything is in place. Like the dishes are all in the dishwasher, the counters are wiped, and I think that I pass that habit on to some of my children because they're the same way. So what's one quirky habit that you have? You can share that in the comments. And then we're going to get started, and I'm going to let Lori start with telling about her homeschooling journey just a little bit.
Well, I didn't start out homeschooling. All of my kids have been to public school at some point in their life. When my oldest was getting ready to start kindergarten, I didn't live where I live now. I lived somewhere where homeschooling was not as prevalent as where we are, is our area now. And probably that time frame too, it wasn't really popular yet.
Right.
And I tossed around the idea of homeschooling, and I let people talk me out of it, telling me that you're just overprotective. Mm-hmm. You just don't want to let go. He's gonna be fine. And I'm like, all right, you're probably right. But that's whenever I first had that thought was in my head, and fast forward to my oldest in 7th grade. He was bullied relentlessly.
So a lot of time passed before you actually thought about it again.
Right. I probably thought about it here and there, but just never dove in because it's scary.
Right. It is scary.
But he was in 7th grade. He was bullied relentlessly, and nothing was being done about it. My middle son, who was in 2nd grade at the time, in 1st grade we had a lot of issues because his sensory processing disorder was really starting to come out at that time because he had to sit still longer.
Mm-hmm, which is really difficult for boys in general.
For kids in general. I mean, any kid has a hard time sitting still, but when you have that added special need, it makes it more difficult. So he had issues in 1st grade, and I tried to see if 2nd grade would help, and it helped. The teacher made a difference, but he still struggled. And my daughter was just in kindergarten, and I was just like, you know what? I'm just going to take them all out and homeschool them. And I think that first year, Kathleen remembers, I think I cried every day.
I was going to say, and that's when I came into the picture because that's when I met Lori.
Yeah.
I had already been homeschooling for many, many years. I homeschooled for 21 years. So I met you how many years ago?
Oh my gosh.
That's been a while.
Yeah.
So
I was a senior now.
He's probably down to the last fourth of my homeschooling years when I met Lori.
Yeah, I think that
Hunter and...
No, I don't think that Hunter was being homeschooled.
Well, so I met her towards the end of my homeschooling years, but I have 7 children, and my oldest daughter, Audrey, went to public school for a couple years, and my second oldest, Amory, went to preschool, and that's it. And that's when I pulled them out when I had 3 children. And then something that made me keep going and keep homeschooling is when we adopted a sibling group of 4. And I knew that throwing them into the public school system was going to be really difficult for them to catch up. First of all, they didn't speak English, so that would have been really mean. And second of all, they had academic delays, so I kept homeschooling. So that's kind of my story in a nutshell, and I homeschooled them the rest of the way through. And right now, this is the first year of not having someone to homeschool. So it's kind of weird to transition. Things are a little bit different.
I'm just starting on that path.
Yes, you're just starting the beginning of the end, right?
Because Alex's getting ready to graduate this year, and it's a little bittersweet.
So next year it's just going to
like,
be...
yay, I did it! Oh my gosh, I did it!
Right. And then next year when you realize that he's doing schoolwork, but it's not the schoolwork that you assigned to him.
Yeah.
That's just such a weird feeling. I just remember that feeling, like they have someone else that's pouring into their life. And one thing, this is kind of a tangent, but one thing that I realized when my kids that went to college got there, that they were perfectly comfortable with speaking to the professor about anything and everything, because they had been used to talking to me about anything and everything. So they look at the professor, and that's the teacher. My mom was my teacher. I didn't agree with what he said in class, so I'm going to stay after and talk to him about it. And that's a good thing. So my first point is homeschooling doesn't have to look like traditional schooling. I have a teacher's degree, so when I pulled my kids out of school, and at the time it was just 1 in 3rd grade, 1 in kindergarten, and then an infant, I thought that I had to have the traditional desks, the schoolroom, which there's nothing wrong with that.
I think we all do that at the beginning, because I did the same thing.
Right. And we get this picture in our mind that we need to go out and buy like that one-room schoolhouse that we drive by all the time.
Right.
And
we need to replicate it.
Right. That we need to replicate what's happening in the schoolroom. And in some ways that's true. We still have to replicate the academics, but we don't have to particularly sit in a desk all day, because one of the reasons that some of us pull our kids out of school, especially someone like JR with a special need, is you don't want to make him sit in a desk for 6 hours, because that was one of the things he struggled with in the school system, was having to sit and try to regulate himself all day.
Yeah.
So homeschooling doesn't have to look like a traditional school. You don't have to. I mean, I even went so far as having a desk up in the front of the room and having all these school desks for my children to sit at. And the thing is, once I got that set up, we did use it, but we didn't use it all day.
Yeah.
We might sit down and do some of our seat work, but then we were up doing either experiments or playing an educational game, or going down to the park and doing some of our read alouds. And so it took me a while to realize that I had the freedom to change it up.
I know. That's a weird feeling, too, because you're like, once you come to that realization that oh yeah, I'm the boss.
Right. I'm the boss and the employee. I get to do it, but
do whatever I want to right now. That's something that JR likes to, he's very touch oriented, like he likes that.
Right.
So he enjoys, whenever he was younger, and he wanted to sit on my exercise ball, or spin around in our spinny desk chair. or we would sit on the trampoline because he could constantly move. He's kind of starting to be able to regulate himself more now that he's older, but he still loves to go in my room and we will relax on my bed and he'll lean against me while we do schoolwork.
Wow. So he needs that touch. He needs that sensory input.
That's what he needs.
And when he was younger, the sensory input was being on the exercise ball or being on the trampoline. And, those things are okay. And one of the things that I had to come to terms with and start allowing, which some people think is kind of weird, was when I was reading the read aloud to my kids, because we used a very literature-rich curriculum, I would let the boys and the girls, if they wanted, play with Legos or color. And I would sporadically ask them a question to make sure that they were paying attention. And usually they were paying more attention when their hands were busy with something else than they were if I said, just sit still. Because I remember going through that phase of, oh my goodness, they have to sit still, they have to sit in a desk, they have to be looking straight at me.
I know.
And they have to be looking like they're giving me 100% concentration. And if they're not doing that, then I'm failing. I'm really failing my job,
I know. I still feel that way sometimes because I'm like, there is no way this child is listening to anything that's coming out of my mouth right now. So I'll stop and I'll ask, what did I just tell you? And he'll just tell me exactly what I just told him.
Right. And it's even funnier when you have a younger one. I can remember when one of my high schoolers was reading A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, which has got some content that is for high schoolers. And we had been discussing it. And I didn't realize my youngest was listening until later that day. He starts spurting out all this information. Remember in that book? And this happened and that girl did this. And I'm like, oh,
oops.
I want to move our discussion to another room. So he was absorbing information even when he wasn't expected to.
Well, that's what JR will, right now he's really into making fishing lures and doing wood burnings. Like I bought him like a little wood burner for Christmas a couple years ago, and he still uses it. And he'll sit there and make those things while I'm reading or giving whatever lesson. And he pays attention more.
Right.
It keeps him occupied, and keeps him engaged.
Right. And I will just add that I understand that in a traditional public or private school setting that they have to have some rules. And I do also know that a lot of public and private schools are loosening up on those and allowing the kids to do some more sensory things because they realize that it's important and they've learned how much that kids learn if they can do something. So, but I just remember having to give myself permission to let my school look different than it did traditionally. And there's always that outside pressure too, either from relatives that are teachers or just well-meaning people that you meet in the grocery store. It's amazing how much we let people influence us when people are saying, let me ask your kid a couple questions because they're homeschooled.
Yeah. Or, comparing to other homeschools and seeing they have an entire room dedicated just for homeschooling.
Right.
I am scattered all over the place. Some think I'm doing it wrong.
But you're not doing it wrong because you're the boss.
Right. I'm the boss.
So we've kind of bled into this second point a little bit. We'll talk about it anyway. Homeschooling as a lifestyle is more than academics.
Yeah.
And it took me a while to have an understanding of that, too. As a mom, we wear so many different hats. We keep the house, we cook dinner, we clean up, and then when we start homeschooling, and maybe our husband shares those responsibilities. I'm not saying that they don't, but when we take on homeschooling, then that's a whole nother hat. And
it's a whole bunch of new hats.
Right. But I can remember at first when I started homeschooling was when I put that hat on, I thought there was a certain time of day that I took it off and it was done.
Yeah.
But that's not how homeschooling is. It's that you're keeping that hat on all the time because it's more than academics. It's more than you sitting there reading. It's those times when you're walking on the trail and the child says, hey, what sort of flower is that? Yeah. And you have your handy dandy
Nature guide.
Nature guide that you pull out of your backpack because you're carrying 50 pounds worth of nature guides just because your kid wants you to.
Yep.
And their water bottle.
And water.
And you pull that out and you look it up right then. So it's not just academics. What you're trying to foster is that that constant thirst for knowledge.
Yeah.
So you don't want to squelch it. And it's hard because sometimes kids go through those phases where they're asking 50 bazillion questions a day. And you just want to say, I don't care about that. No. I mean, we get to that point where it's just like...
That's honest, though. There's
Right.
sometimes you're like, I don't care. Stop asking me questions.
Stop asking. I don't know what that is, and I don't want to know.
But we can't because...
We can't. And we can, but one thing that we can do as our kids mature a little bit is we can lead them to the resources so that they can begin to look those things up themselves.
Right.
And right now, like I know that Lori's kids like this. YouTube is a great tool. You can look up just about anything. So, and you know, when I started out, it was
the stuff that they watch is, I'm like, what? I'll watch what they're watching. Well, sometimes it's just, stupid stuff like gameplays. I'm like, why are you watching someone play a game when you can actually play it yourself, But a lot of times, that's how JR learned how to make a lot of his fishing lures, because he watches those YouTube videos.
Right. And that's something that we definitely didn't have growing up. We didn't have access to that. So let's go on to, kind of are meshing all these points together, but we'll just keep going through them.
That's because it's our lifestyle.
That's right. Homeschooling as a lifestyle aims for character development, community-minded kids, and life skills. Well, there's definitely a lot in that one because it was also a journey for me to realize that I was more concerned about my kids' character than I was about their grades or academics, because character will take you all the way through life.
Yeah.
Whereas grades will only get you so far.
I think I still battle with that at times.
Right. Well, I think it's a constant battle when you're a mom and you're a homeschooler. You're, especially if you belong to a homeschool co-op, you're always looking at everybody else and you hear someone come in and, my child just got this award and this scholarship and this, that. And you're like,
my child graduated at age 16.
Right. And you're like, oh my goodness, my child can't pass a spelling test. Or my kid can't even get up in front of a group of children and give a speech yet. But those are all just, each one of our children is different and unique.
They have different strengths.
They have different strengths and weaknesses, but I would rather my child have kindness than earn a good grade some way that I pressured that child. There's nothing wrong with earning a good grade, and there are plenty of kids that are super, super intelligent, and that's great, because my first one was like that. I didn't really have to teach her.
Yeah.
It was more just direct her in the right direction, and she was a self-learner.
Yeah, that's how Alec is.
But that doesn't develop character. You still have to work on that character, and it's more important to me. It became more important to me that my kids would have good character than them just having good grades.
Yeah.
And, we want our kids to be community-minded. I'll let Lori talk about what her kids do that's community-minded.
Oh, gosh. So every week we go to a local outreach center that has a food pantry, and at first they were very hesitant. Well, Alec wasn't. He's always like dives head first into everything. But
yeah.
I haven't talked much about Rebecca. I've only talked about Alec and JR.
There's a little girl named Rebecca.
There is. She just kind of goes along with everything. So
she goes with the flow.
But JR was very nervous about it and not sure what to expect. But that's kind of his personality too. If it's something new and we have to transition and he's not sure what to expect, he's very nervous about it. And it comes out in ways you wouldn't anticipate. But now they love it and want to go every week. Every time it's open, they want to go and help these people that don't have much. And it's just, I I'm amazed by them, actually, and how much they want to help.
And that's part of it. It's amazing to watch our children do outreach because we're constantly feeding into them and feeding into them, and to see it pouring out of them, because we did the same thing when my kids were little. My parents ran a food pantry and a clothes closet, and that's what we did on Wednesdays. And we would go down there and put together the food boxes or sort clothes or do those sorts of things. And another thing we did was we went to a local nursing home, and my eldest daughter adopted another grandfather and got to follow his life until the very end. In fact, we were out of town when he got put in the hospital, and they didn't think he was going to make it. And she was 12 at the time, and she was just determined that I had to drive her back 2.5 hours and go to the hospital. And we did. And we went to go visit him, her adopted grandfather, before he died. And then we got to sing some hymns with him and talk to him. And then we went to his funeral. So kids are, they need to be part of life.
They do.
They need to be participating in life, and they need to be participating in death in that way. Watching someone and being part of that life and mourning someone, so that when it hits them a little closer to home, which that hit Audrey really close, but when it hits them a little closer to home, that they have something to retrieve from their past. They know how to
work through that.
Right. Start working through that.
Yeah. And I know as long as as soon as he was old enough in the church, he was volunteering to help in the kids' church and Dash, whatever they had that he could volunteer for, he was doing it.
Right,
because
and that's good.
Because that's where his heart is. His heart's in ministry, and that's what he wants to go into anyway. So, and I've seen that from a very early age.
And it's nice to have a really good community-minded church, because then the church is already doing outreach, and then your kids have several opportunities to participate in that in the church, like you said, in kids' church, or helping with the kids' choir, or, I did a lot of those things alongside my kids. Helping with the kids' choir, helping with the dramas, those sorts of things, so that they could participate in them and we could be on the same schedule. But yeah, and then the life skills. That's so important that these kids have life skills, and we have an opportunity to start those life skills very early on at home. And we have more time to do that because we homeschool.
Yeah.
I can remember when one of my daughters first got a job, and she was working at the movie theater, and the manager had given this other young girl a broom and said, "I need you to sweep the foyer." And the girl didn't know how to use a broom. And my daughter was laughing at her. I'm sorry, but she came home and said,
that blows.
She doesn't know how to use a broom, Mom.
That makes me laugh, too, because it's like, what? A broom?
Well, kids are so busy nowadays with school and sports. When would they have time to do chores at home? And
well, the fact that Alec has had a job since he had his license is major, because I didn't have a job until I was almost graduated. So I was 18 and almost out of school before I had my first real job. I had no idea how to balance a checkbook. I had no idea what a savings account was. I had no idea about any of those things because they didn't teach that in school.
Right. And those are life skills that we need to know. And I'm thankful to my parents, even though I wasn't thankful at the time, that they were dragging me around to volunteer for things and helping my mom with layout on a newspaper. This was before computer and those kind of things. I was learning some life skills. Plus, when my stepfather retired from the military, we moved from Colorado to West Virginia and bought an old farmhouse, and we remodeled it. And I mean, we remodeled it. So I was constantly learning new things with my mom, how to take the paint off the wood. We had this.
And you didn't have YouTube to tell you how.
No, we didn't. We just had trial and error.
Yeah.
And so life skills is so important. And the thing is, like, we said you don't have to be a homeschool parent to apply some of these things we're talking about. You have more time when you're a homeschool parent because you're obviously at home more.
Yeah.
And your kids are at home more. But all of these things can be applied. In fact, a friend of ours who's going to be on the podcast at some point, we used to call her the public homeschooling mom because her kids were going to school, but she was doing all of these, what we called homeschooling traits she had. So it's not just for homeschoolers. Okay, let's go on to the next one. Ooh, this one, I like this one. Homeschooling as a lifestyle means kids have more time to delve into different creative pursuits, to explore what their bent is. That scripture that says, train up a child in the way he should go, some versions say, in his bent. Train up a child in his particular bent, because each of our children have different gifts, and that's what we mean by bent. They lead in different directions. They see the world differently, and they have creative pursuits that they can delve into when they have the time. For example, one of my sons who very much liked cars, we did a whole year of science just on the technology of cars. I found science books that just talked about everything about how cars were invented, how they worked, different parts, and he could tell you 100,000 times more things about cars than I could when we finished that year because he absorbed the information a lot more. And he is the son that when we were driving down the road would say, do you know what kind of car that is? And I'd be, yellow. That's a yellow car.
Yellow.
And he would know what kind of car it was, what kind of engine it had, all of those sorts of things. It's definitely not a van.
It's got 4 doors, I think.
So when you're homeschooling, you if you give yourself permission, it's very difficult as a homeschooling mom, especially if you're type A, like I am, to say, I don't have to do that particular science this year. I can choose myself what's best for my child. Because I don't know about you, but nobody asks me what I did in 9th grade science anymore.
Nope.
Nobody asks me what English course I took when I was in 10th grade. Nobody asks me those questions anymore at all. Mm-mm. In fact, if they want me to write something, they ask me if I can write, if I'm a writer, which I am. So it's not about that. We need to remember that. We're preparing our children for life. We're not preparing them. They don't have to do the same thing that everybody else is doing because they're not the same as everybody else.
Right. That's what Rebecca, she's only 11. And she loves to write. She likes to draw. She's very creative. She likes to make things. She loves to do effect makeup.
Oh yeah,
she loves it. Like she wants me to buy her latex so that she can do weird things to her face. I don't know.
I think you should. She's really good at it.
I know. She is really good at it. I let her do my makeup, but she watches YouTube to figure out how. But anyway, so it's something that shocked me. Whenever I give her that freedom, she had a writing prompt in her writer book to tell why. What the bad parts of smoking was.
Oh, this is good.
Yeah. And she was just supposed to write like an essay. And she's like, Mom, can I write a poem instead? The poem that came out of that tiny little head, I looked at her and I was like,
unbelievable.
Who are you?
Mm-hmm.
You're not 11. That's like adult work there that you just spit out in a matter of 20 minutes.
It would have made me stop smoking if I were a smoker.
Yeah, it was amazing.
And the amazing thing is she had been here for a podcast recording on the 6 risk factors. And that little girl absorbed so much of that information while she was crawling around on the floor. Even though she's not a baby, she just likes to slither around underneath my furniture and clean it for me. And
with her clothing.
Right, with her clothing. She absorbed so much information.
Yeah.
And it was amazing. And so it came out when she was doing that science lesson.
It did, yeah. And like she said that's what, whenever she absorbed all that information, she's like, I'm going to make sure my emotional state is amazing whenever I'm pregnant because that affects my baby and I want my baby to grow up. And I'm like, what?
Yes. Yes.
You're 11.
She's absorbing it. Now, see, and that is a situation where she was somewhere she normally wouldn't have been had she been in a traditional schooling environment, or if you were a homeschooler who thought everything has to be traditional, because you would have said, first of all, I can't do a podcast at 10 or 11 in the morning.
We are
and second
busy
of
doing
all,
school.
Right, we have to sit in our desks, and you can't listen to grown-ups recording a podcast because that's what grown-ups do. Yeah. You know what I mean? You have to give yourself permission to open up that whole world for your children, and they will absorb so much more than you think they will.
Yeah.
And and let me just say this, let your kids get bored. People say this all the time, I don't want my kid to be bored, or, they keep saying, what should I do? They're bored. Let them be bored, because it's not until they become bored that they figure out how to do something themselves or become creative themselves.
Right.
It's just like that child that whenever spring hits and you say, you need to go outside, and they say, there's nothing to do out there. And you keep sending them back out there. And especially if they have siblings, they'll figure out something to do. Next thing you know, they're building a fort or building a dam or digging a hole in your yard, which you can fill back up. It's okay. You'll live. I've had that happen.
Or trip in it.
Or trip in it. Don't let Lori run in your yard because she will trip in it.
Or JR. That's how he broke his collarbone.
Oh, no. Okay, let's go on to the next one.
Yeah, before I tell any horror stories about JR.
Homeschooling as a lifestyle allows kids to learn at their own pace and style instead of being put in a box. Mm-hmm. It makes me think of that old Pete Seeger song, Little Boxes, Tiny Boxes, talking about everybody doing exactly the same thing, living in the same kind of houses, all going to college, and they all look just the same, he says, and we don't all have to look the same. The truth is, the people who are most successful are usually the people who do things differently than the norm.
Yeah.
And we have to allow that space. And I learned that early on in my homeschooling because of adoption. When my kids came home to me and they had academic and developmental delays, and I had to teach a 7-year-old how to read again in a different language that I had to come to terms with. They weren't going to be at the same level and stage as their peers at the homeschool co-op.
Yeah.
And if you don't come to terms with that, you're constantly going to be frustrated with your child, which I went through a lot of that. I mean, I would be frustrated with my child and thinking, why can't you just get that and catch up with everybody? But that's just not fair to them. And it just puts more pressure on them, which delays the learning even more.
Yeah. It reminds me of whenever I first took all the kids out, and JR was in 3rd grade, my first year I started homeschooling him. And so I tried to push him for reading and writing on his grade level. And
Right.
He was behind. He was very much behind. And it took me a long time, and probably a little bit of you, to convince me that it's okay to start back over. I know
Yes.
he was in 3rd grade, but he's not getting it, and pushing him is just frustrating him and making him feel like he's stupid.
Right.
So-
and that's what they read into it.
Yeah.
Especially if you're pushing. And I got to the point that first year of homeschooling all my newbies that I was teaching a 5-year-old two 5-year-olds how to read. And so the 6-year-old, the 7-year-old, and 8-year-old would all participate in the phonics lessons all together. So I just put them all together, and we all did phonics together, and they all started making progress together. And I just needed to give myself permission. I know I keep saying that, but I think it's so important, because we get in our minds that everything has to be this certain way, and we're really good at that in our culture. We make up all these rules for everything.
Yeah.
And we're afraid to break all those rules. But those same rules can make us frustrated and make us frustrated with our children and end up just causing way too much pain for ourselves and for our children. Right. So we just need to remember that we can go at our own pace. And some kids on the other end of that spectrum will go faster. My oldest daughter was graduated by the time she was 16, and she decided, well, with my helping her decide, to stay at home another year, because just because she was academically mature doesn't mean that I thought that she was ready to go out into the big wide world.
Right.
And she stayed home another year and helped me homeschool the 2 youngest ones. In fact, she put together the curriculum for them, and she was very creative with it. And they had probably a lot more fun with her than they did with me, because she did a lot of like Roman feasts and made togas. They had a blast. Yeah, they had a blast with her. So, homeschooling as a lifestyle, this is number 6, means intermingling with people of all ages and stages, which we've kind of covered a little bit. You have freedom to join in your community during the day, which we did talk about that a lot, but it does. It gives you more freedom. I mean, Lori, she was here at 10 o'clock.
Yep.
Which is, in our traditional schooling mind is like, oh no, the kids need to be sitting in their desk at 10 o'clock and you need to be doing this certain way. Well, your kids can learn so much by going out into the community during the day. One of the things that my 2 youngest did for several years was help serve at the soup opera. They would go once a month with my sister. She would come and pick them up. And, of course, the big draw for them initially was she picked up donuts on the way for everybody at the soup opera.
We get donuts.
Yes, and that was it. We're going, we get donuts. But then they would come home and tell these stories of what they'd seen and how they interacted with people and how they got to talk to people.
Yeah.
And they looked forward to it and they enjoyed it. And, that's one of the things that you can participate in your community more, and you're allowed to call it school.
I know. Well, that's what a lot of people at the outreach center are like, these are your kids? Did they not have school today? And then I tell them they're homeschooled. Oh my gosh, that's so amazing. Like, a lot of people are like, they're like, are amazed at their ages and how much they help and how much they interact with adults, and people are used to them, kids are supposed to be seen, not heard,
Right. And yeah.
But they're just amazed at how well spoken they are and how they can interact with everybody and not just people their own age. But yeah, that's something.
Right. That's one of the myths about homeschoolers is, we often see in the media, they'll pick out the social introverted homeschooling family who never leaves their home and make that the big example. And the truth is, most of the homeschoolers that I've interacted with over the past 21 years, the kids are very articulate. Mm-hmm. They can speak with anyone, and they're very well versed in a bunch of subjects, and they can talk about just anything. And if they don't know something about the subject, they'll ask the person. If we're out on a field trip or just out at a museum, the kids will just start asking questions. Yeah. And sometimes that really throws adults for a loop.
It does, because they're not used to kids just being inquisitive about everything. I know myself, just because of my personality, I would totally be a hermit if it wasn't for my children. They pull me out of my house.
Introverts unite and stay at home and never leave your house.
But we'll go to, like, it's funny because Alec will go to, like, a store or something. I don't like to just go up to people and ask help for things, okay? It's just, it takes me out of my comfort zone.
Right.
I'd rather just find it myself.
Yeah, I don't. I'm an introvert, but I don't mind asking
but
people.
Alec will look at me and he'll be like, Mom, just ask. They work here. That's the point. And
That's their job.
I'm like, you go ask. You ask it for me.
Lori's children have more life skills than she does.
They do. It's true.
Okay, so let's go on to number 7. Homeschooling as a lifestyle is great for kids who have a creative bent. The arts, music, literature, and I will even say science. I just was saying that because I was going to use the example of my oldest daughter, Audrey, who is an awesome, wonderful writer. She has surpassed me so much so far. And whenever she was in high school, I made her, Lori and I were just talking about this before we started recording, I made her actually work through the writing curriculum, even though she was fighting the outlining, and I just want to be creative, and I don't want to do it this way, but I made her do that. But often what she would do when she finished with school in the afternoon is she would sit down at the computer and write for 3 hours at a time. Mm-hmm. And if she had been in public school, she probably wouldn't have had the time or the energy to do that. And so she got to practice her craft over and over again. And I'd say the same thing about my other girls. Amory and Anya are very creative, and they like to sew and do crafts, and they're always pulling out projects and doing those things when they were bored.
Yep.
And that just really enhanced their creativity. They got to keep working on that.
It takes a lot because my daughter's very creative. She likes to collect things like bits of ribbon or pieces of pretty paper. And I'm like, that's garbage. No, Mom, I'm going to make something. And it takes a lot for me not to just throw it all out.
Right.
But she does, but she's true to her word. She makes something out of it, you know?
Right.
And she's very creative with it. And I know with Alec, he has more freedom to do things like whenever we used to do Scrooge.
Yes.
That was constant. A lot of practices. And the reason that we could do that and still have school was because I homeschooled. It wasn't as difficult on us.
Right. And there were kids in that production that did go to public school, and I felt really bad for them because we would have these late night practices, and then they had to get up in the morning
and go to school
super, super early, and we could let our kids who were part of that production sleep in a little bit. And it's the same with my kids. Several of my kids were parts of plays at the local college, and we'd come home from a practice and get home at 10, and I'd think, I'm not going to wake them up at 7 tomorrow. I'm going to let them get a little extra sleep before we start school in the morning. So you have that freedom, and you don't have to wear your kids out for them to participate in what they need to participate in or want to participate in.
Right. And I think that because Alec's heart is in ministry and he wants to be a children's church minister, that those kind of skills will help him in that endeavor.
Right, exactly. So you're always, they're working towards the goal of who they want to become and they want to be, instead of working towards the goal of a checklist that somebody wrote in a book. That your kindergartner can do this, skip, hop, jump, all those jump rope, and
I still have.
Sometimes we moms go through those religiously. Oh my gosh, she can't skip. What are we going to do? What are you, and it's just ridiculous because each child is different. Mm. They have a different bent. They have different gifts and talents, and we need to pour into what they're going to be instead of pour into what everybody else thinks they need to be.
Things they need to learn.
Right.
Yeah.
So the next one, number 8. Homeschooling as a lifestyle means you don't feel guilty for taking field trips in the middle of the day.
Does the grocery store count?
Sometimes it does. One thing I used to do with the grocery store is I'd give each of my kids their own list.
Yeah.
and the younger kids got a picture list. So obviously I had to stay with the younger kids and guide them around. You know, they might have a picture of an apple. They had to find the apple. And then you could talk about what kinds of apples there are.
Right.
There's Granny Smith and Macintosh and Fuji and...
Or like my daughter, well, not just my daughter, all of them. I point out, you know, that the apples aren't 86 cents a piece, you know, 86 cents per pound.
Right.
So then we have to measure in the little scale how much is a pound, how many apples we can get, and how much it'd be if we want more than 1 pound, you know. And then at the register, especially whenever they have like their own money and they want to buy things, I'm like, you need to remember tax.
Right. And then they're trying to calculate the tax in their head at the last minute.
Yep. Make sure they have enough.
Right. And the thing is, when you practice those sorts of things, the kids keep practicing them all the time. I can remember driving my kids to swim practice at the local college, and there was a homeschool boy, good friend of ours, who we'd take turns giving rides with these parents. And so I had this other kid in the car, and we passed this giant billboard that says, how many kinds of apples can you name? Can you name 5? And we see the billboard, and he shouts it out. Okay, everybody name 5 apples. Like, it becomes part of their lifestyle. They're constantly thinking. They're constantly curious. They're constantly testing themselves and each other because they're beginning to self-educate. And it's not just something that's within a schoolroom. Of course, I did hear from one of my kids quite frequently if I tried to do something like that. We're not in school right now. You can't ask me that. So...
I know. That's what. That's something that I try to sneak it in with JR sometimes, because I will notice something that we just went through in science or something like that. We did that last year. We did sea creatures, and that's what we studied. And then we went to the beach last summer, and so I would be like, hey, remember when we talked about this? And JR, at first, he wouldn't catch on, and then he'd be like, Mom, we're not in school. It's break time.
Right. And they say that, but you know it's still soaking in.
It is.
Which is really, we just covered number 9, which is homeschooling as a lifestyle means everyone, including Mom, is always learning.
That's right.
I definitely learned a lot more homeschooling than I did in my traditional schooling the first time around, because... maybe I wasn't paying as much attention then, or I was doing it just because I needed to pass the test.
Exactly, and
it wasn't that interesting then.
I think that's where we get. We want to pass the test. That's how we were. And I know now, like you said, I hated history when I was in school. I hated it so much. I'm like, this is so dumb. Why do I need to learn this? You know, that was my attitude. Same thing with math. Although algebra I still hate. But now whenever I go through this history and stuff, I'm like, oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that. Even though I probably was taught it the first time around.
Right.
But it's you know, and hopefully because we're doing it differently, it'll soak in more.
Right, and there's so many different varieties of curriculum available now that you can make those choices of finding something that's more interesting to your child than just reading in 1492 Columbus sailed the ocean blue. And you're like, oh my gosh, I don't want to read that.
I'm pretty sure that's the only statistic I learned in history my entire life.
I just know that from history songs. In 1492, there was a great conquest. See? And that's from homeschooling, not from public schooling.
That's funny.
And it's funny because when my kids started taking exams for college, they would come home and say, or call me and say, Mom, one of those songs that you made us listen to popped in my head in the middle of the test. And it was helpful to them. They just thought it was funny and annoying at the same time.
It is funny.
And then one of my kids said, I was taking this history test, Mom, in college. And she said, I think I just wrote out the whole plot of one of the books that we had as a read aloud. Which was true. And she got it right. And it was good. But that's how she learned it.
That's funny.
So the last one, number 10. Homeschooling as a lifestyle doesn't end when the child graduates. The goal of education is self-education. When your kids develop this habit, they don't lose it when you hand them a diploma. And I'm going to talk about my oldest, and all of my other kids have done this too, but this was kind of my introduction into what happened when the kid went away to college. Audrey and her roommate were both homeschooled. So when they got to their freshman year of college, they were kind of the odd people in the apartment building, because when they didn't know something, they were always looking up words on dictionary.com, and they were looking up recipes, and they were cooking real meals, and their apartment mates didn't know how to cook very well, or maybe didn't know how to, like, they just kept doing that homeschooling lifestyle over and over and over again. And I see it in all of my kids now. When any of them get together and they don't know something, even my sons-in-law, and one of my sons-in-law was homeschooled for a part of his schooling, and they do the same thing. Let's look that up. And then there's a debate for the next hour on what fact is right, and what is this, should we believe this, or should we believe this website, or should we look it up in this book, or how about we look this up in a book? So that it continues, and they don't just say, okay, school's over, I graduated, I'm finished. No more thinking. I'm not learning anything. I'm moving on. It just becomes a lifestyle. And I see it in my 3 daughters who now have children. If they want to know something, they're going to find it out. They don't wait for someone to tell them.
They ask you, or they probably look it up. Or...
Right. Well, I can remember my 2 oldest daughters, when they first got married, they would call me and say, how do you make mashed potatoes again? Like, they knew, they had done it with me.
Yeah.
But they didn't just say, oh my gosh, I don't know how to do this. Or I don't know how to run a household. Or I don't know how to do this. Or I don't know how to go get the oil changed. And we affectionately call it adulting. And they'll say, Mom, I'm adulting today. I have to do this.
Yeah.
What do I have to do this?
Technically, we're always adulting once we become adults, but, you know.
Well, sometimes we don't want to be.
I know. I never want to be an adult. So.
But we do it anyway.
Well, that's encouraging to me because, you know, my oldest is getting ready to graduate. And I'm like, well, what happens next? What's going to happen? You know,
he's not going to change into another person. He's still going to he's still going to be the person that you've invested all this time in, and he's going to keep using those habits that you've taught him, and his character is going to stay intact, which is great. I mean, I think that's wonderful.
Yeah, because I like his character.
Right, I do too. So thanks for joining us today. Make sure you like this podcast and share it. And please leave a comment, or if there's something that you would like to see us talk about on this podcast, then definitely leave a comment about that. So thanks for joining us.
We're so glad you could join us here for the Whole House podcast. Please subscribe, and if you give us a review, we might pick our favorite and send you a prize. Please remember to like the Whole House Facebook page and follow us on Instagram at _whole_house. And please sign up with your email on our website, thewholehouse.org, to be notified when new things are happening here at the Whole House. Thanks so much for listening.